What's up, everybody? My name is David Parsons. This is the Nostalgia Trap podcast. Thank you so much for tuning into the show and for listening to these conversations and for spreading them on social media. And especially thank you to the people who are donating to the Patreon. I know that, we live in an age where everybody's got their hand out, crowdfunding everything from, healthcare to their next art project, independent films, every kind of project is asking for your attention and your money. I know that. And, I feel like sometimes, the crowdfunding thing is like walking down the street of New York City and people have their hand out and you feel bad for them and you want to give money to them, but you can't help everybody. And I understand that. And I really appreciate the people that are giving money to the show and kind of showing that they care about this program, because it really means a lot to me to see even $1 or $5 a month from people that I don't know at all personally, but feel somehow that the show is connecting with them, and I really appreciate that. So if you want to become a patron, you can do that at patreon.com/nostalgiatrap and sign up for any amount of money you want to give a month. It's all very helpful, and for me, it really kind of keeps me going and keeps the whole project going, because it's not easy to do when both me and Peter Sabatino, who produces the show, are working. We're both working full time. We have a lot going on as we try to make actual money to feed our families. But the podcast is really important to us, and we want to keep going with it. So if you have the ability to give a little money, it lets us know that we should keep doing it, and our efforts are connecting with people, and that's important to us. So thank you for that, and I hope you enjoy the conversation we have for you today. This is someone who I met through the podcast. I've been lucky enough to make connections with people online that are interested in the show, interested in some of the themes of the show. His name is Daniel Bessner. He is currently a professor in American foreign policy at the University of Washington, and we talk a lot about the kind of work he did in graduate school and the work he's doing now. He kind of has a take on this idea of the kind of like the intellectual's role in American democracy. And one of the reasons that I became interested in his work is because he told me, and he tells me on this podcast. We talk a lot about this project. He's doing research about the Rand Corporation, which, for many of you, you may know that the Rand Corporation, certainly for me, the only thing I know about Rand is kind of its connection to the Vietnam War and Daniel Ellsberg and the Pentagon Papers and all that kind of stuff. To me, the Rand Corporation is basically, the Nazi scientists that created the Vietnam War, and particularly mapped out the practical parameters of really, really horrific war crimes. So that was my view of Rand, and Daniel has a very, very different take. He's got a more complex view of the history of this organization, what it's really about, and what he ends up explaining to me is kind of like how, not necessarily Rand, but how the Rand sheds light on the idea of what an intellectual role might be within a larger left project. And I thought that ended up being a kind of fascinating take on the idea of think tanks and the idea of what, an intellectual academic elite or vanguard really is, and how it might be compatible with the left project. So we kind of explored that topic, and I think we had a really fun time doing that. And I really appreciate Daniel's work and his joining me on the podcast to tell me a little bit about it, because it's really good stuff. You can find his book on Amazon and everywhere else you find books. It's called Democracy in Exile, Hans Speier and the Rise of the Defense Intellectual. And again, he's working on a whole bunch of exciting stuff. So check his stuff out online. And again, thanks for all the people who are supporting the show. You can find more Nostalgia Trap episodes at nostalgiatrap.com. And if you want to support the show and get bumper stickers and buttons and stuff from me in the mail every once in a while, and support a show that is trying to bring these voices to a wider and wider audience, you can do that at nostalgiatrap.com. You can do that at patreon.com/nostalgiatrap. Again, thanks so much for tuning into the show, and enjoy this conversation. This is me talking with Professor Daniel Bessner. Daniel, so great to talk to you. This is a kind of like it's a history-based podcast, so I wanted to start with maybe, a date and ask you, maybe inappropriately, what year were you born?
I was born in 1984.
1984.
October 84.
Nice.
1984.
Right.
Yes.
Right. Square in the middle of the Reagan years.
Yes, right in the middle of the Reagan years. My first political memory actually was someone walking back from I lived next to a public school, voting for the 1988 presidential election, and they voted for Bush, and my parents voted for Dukakis. And I remember thinking that they were an evil and bad person for doing so. I really thought Dukakis was going to go all the way.
Wow.
But
I think that's 1988, right? That's
88.
That's the year that Jesse Jackson went pretty far in the primaries that year.
Yes.
I was a little older than you, but I think I think that is probably the first presidential election I remember. You were young for that one.
Yeah, it was sort of a blink memory. That's not. I think it was just the heightened emotion.
You didn't have a sophisticated take on the election. So
no, it was pretty much good versus evil.
I always like to hear about the kind of political orientation, if there was any, for your parents. I mean, was politics a subject of conversation in your house?
A little bit, I guess. I would describe it as my parents were typical New York liberal Jews, basically until I would say the War on Terror, where they turned. I wouldn't say I don't think they ever actually voted for George W. Bush, but I think they turned like sort of hardcore national security for when America collectively lost its mind. Between 2001,
it's incredible because you said, you said during the Bush years, and to me when I hear that, and I'm sure this is the same for you, it's like, okay, I don't know what you're going to say next. It could have gone either way because like for some people, the Bush years radicalized them and they went left, and others went kind of into this, hard right national security thing you're talking about. That's disappointing.
And I think. Yeah, well, it's interesting. I think it's really interesting for a lot of, I would say, Jews of their generation, people who really came of age in the 60s and the 70s, and in the Six-Day War and not the 60s, but the Arab-Israeli War of 67, and I went to Jewish day school, so I have to get that language out of my mind. But then the War of 73, I think it really, really radicalized them in sort of a sense being very pro-Israel. Mm-hmm. And I think the Israel politics were very critical for them. And like a lot of Jews of their generation for making them sort of right-wing in the Bush years. But no, they're back to being Democrats. So
interesting. Yeah, I love that. I love watching the parental flux in my life because I've experienced similar kind of waves of different kinds of politics embraced by my parents over the years. So at what point? Where exactly? You say you're in New York. Where were you in Long Island?
So I was raised actually mostly in Rockaway, Queens, which I don't know if you're aware of Rockaway, but it was destroyed during Hurricane Sandy.
That's right.
And it's actually one of my good friends has a really good description for it. It's sort of people who moved from Brooklyn, who moved from being working class to being more middle class, but often not in the professions, not like usually law or doctors, even though there are some of those. But it's like people who became contractors or who became very successful plumbers. So it's a really unique sort of South Brooklyn community in Rockaway, Queens. So that's where I made my grew up. Essentially, and then my parents moved to Long Island.
Okay, yeah, that's what I was kind of wondering if they're still there because we had a fire here in the town that I'm in, Ventura, recently that affected a similar socioeconomic demographic. And I'm interested to see what happens to that neighborhood. I don't know. I haven't followed like what happened to Rockaway in the years after Sandy.
It's actually really interesting because Rockaway is actually a very politically important group because a lot of firefighters and police officers live there.
That's right.
So, and they're often higher up in the unions, right? So even though something like Breezy Point was really destroyed in Hurricane Sandy and is built on a sandbar and maybe will be destroyed in the future, they were still able to get a lot of money from the city, from what I understand, in order to rebuild. So it's, again, interesting how sort of these local political things work, especially in New York, where you have these long-standing ethnic communities. Rockaway being a heavily Irish community going back, 100 years with deep connections to the city. So it's really fascinating. So Rockaway is rebuilt. Hopefully won't be destroyed again soon, but it doesn't look good given recent
right. I mean, they have 50 years tops, I think, out there. It's with climate change. I mean,
I agree. Yeah.
I think that these are things that kind of like go. They just kind of appear in the news and then fade away. But you'll hear the New York Times has done some like major reports on climate change that have been like the things they're projecting are just insane. And it just like I feel like people don't know how to process it, so it just kind of like goes away and you don't hear much about it. But little things like New York City will be drowning in 50 years is something that I certainly paid attention to.
Yeah, I mean, and it's also really interesting because it just shows the dangers of really terraforming and what human beings could do. Like if you look at a map from Rockaway in the 1850s, it's really a tiny, tiny, tiny sandbar. But now if you look at it, it's much more expansive because I think when they cleared Battery Park, they put a lot of that soil and sand to make Rockaway essentially much bigger, but it's an artificial barrier that will get periodically, hopefully not, but looks to be periodically destroyed by hurricanes or massive superstorms.
Good Lord.
And it's really interesting. We're sort of, we've paid the piper and we'll see what happens now.
Yeah. So, I mean, thinking about that kind of like broad historical stuff, I mean, you ended up being a historian in your life. But when you look back on your life and your youth, especially, do you feel like you could have seen it coming, or do you? Was history so? What was history to you when you were a kid? Like, how did you get interested in that?
History. This is kind of maybe depressing, and I think it says something about the community I grew up in. But really, history was the Holocaust. From very young, very, very early on, I'm without exaggeration, 4, 5, 6, learning about the Holocaust, learning about, the oppression of Jews in Europe. And then as you got older, I went to a Jewish day school, and really that was part of the curriculum from very, very early on. I'm not still sure that it is, which is really something interesting. And I think this actually says a lot about Jewish American politics in the United States. But, very early on learning about the Holocaust, I remember I read William Shirer's tome, his magnum opus, Rise and Fall of the Third Reich, when I was like 14 or 15. I had just been dumped by my high school girlfriend, and I found solace in the Rise and Fall of the Third Reich. So that
is a huge book. Yeah. I see it I see it on the shelf all the time in bookstores, and I'm like, I should read that. And then I'm like, that looks daunting. It's insane to think of you reading it at 14 as like solace for a breakup with your girlfriend. It's insane.
It was like solace and maybe even penance. Penance. I had to put myself through something intense. But I really, in college and stuff, I did actually a dual degree program at Columbia University in the Jewish Theological Seminary. You get a BA from both of these schools. And I really wanted to study the Holocaust, but as I actually got more and more into it, I kind of realized that this is not something that I think I had much to contribute to. There was so much written about the Holocaust, and a lot of the questions that I found interesting about the functioning of the Nazi state were, to my mind, at least as a 21, 22-year-old, were satisfactorily answered. So I started to move away and look into other topics of interest.
And was history something that, because for me, I mean, my formative experience was like AP U.S. history in high school, and kind of like learning that there was history that existed beyond just kind of like, I don't know, Steven Spielberg movies and things like that. But AP U.S. history in high school, I mean, was that something that you went through? Did you do that? Did you do that class? And at what point is history starting to be something that you're doing more as like I don't know, as like an academic practice rather than just a solace from your girlfriend?
Yeah, I doubt she'd be listening to this, but that'd be hilarious if she was. I did do the whole AP US track, AP Euro track. I mean, and they were good, and I found it interesting. But I always remember, even from when I was a little kid, 4th, 5th grade, being bored in school and reading ahead in the history textbooks, you know, because it was a story.
Yep.
You know, like I didn't want to listen to someone ramble on about, I don't know, let's say rabbinics. So I would look in my history textbook and sort of read ahead. But I think the major shift came when I was 21, 22, when a lot of my friends, you know, everyone's deciding what they're doing in 21, 22. And most of my friends at the time, I graduated in 2006, a lot of them went into finance and the rest of them went into law. And I just knew that I really had no desire to do any of those things. And I also knew that I really enjoyed the college college lifestyle, frankly. And I think academics don't talk enough about this. We really have, I think, one of the last good jobs in America, only if you're on the tenure track, not if you're an adjunct or anything else. It's obviously terrible and there's really exploitation, but an ideal tenured academic profession is really, I think, one of the last good jobs in America in the sense that you control your time.
Yeah.
And I really didn't want to have anyone control my time. It was less about not having a boss, but, as a young atheist, thinking that we only had one life to live, which I still think, I wanted to have time. And that was a really big decision. I think actually of my, group of friends in college, I am the only one who went into academia, which says something also about the time and the social class and a bunch of other interesting
things. It's the same for me, and it's I'm glad you mentioned that lifestyle thing of like the academic lifestyle. I mean, we talk about it a lot as a kind of like the 1940s, 1950s, like really like academic fantasy, and it was a very like it was a very narrow time for academia. Mostly, I mean, almost 100% white males. But the idea that there was that was a valued career has kind of fallen off. And in part, I worry about the language about teachers. It feels like the especially the right wing language about teachers is exactly that like they're lazy, they get all these months off and they shouldn't, and there's kind of this feeling that like teachers are getting, and particularly college professors are like getting away with something. It's really scary to me because I feel like you're right, that it is one of the best remaining jobs in terms of your ability to control your own destiny and control your own time.
Right. And I think that's really just the right-wing critique of it. And you even hear some of this, amongst my liberal friends. They're like shocked how much time or what I could do. Not that I quote unquote have off, but just that I'm in control of it. And I think that's a peculiarly American sickness to value the suffering, being
totally.
at work for 10 hours a day. And it's so, to me, it's so strange. Instead of criticizing teachers or especially college professors for being in control of their time, I don't understand why people don't just fight for being in control of their own time.
Right.
Instead, all these technologies were supposed to allow people to work less because, you could be quote unquote more productive. But instead of doing that, people have just become shackled even more to their desks or even more to their iPhones or whatever the case may be, instead of fighting for time. And I don't think that we talk about time enough from a left-wing perspective as being a really critical element of being, compensated for your labor. I mean, Moshe Pistone of University of Chicago wrote about this a bit in Time, Labor, and Social Domination. But I mean, I really feel like academics are compensated for and having control over their own fucking destinies.
Yeah. It's a point that's raised by I think it's Noam Chomsky in the Manufacturing Consent movie. Like he's interviewed, he makes the point so simply. Like he does it, it's very straightforward. He kind of talks about how, people shouldn't have to rent their lives out to a private corporation in order to eat and in order to survive. And the idea that you kind of like give your time away that way, and how profound that is. I mean, it would be one thing if you were doing that, a little bit throughout the week, but the idea that people work 60, 70, 80-hour weeks with virtually no time beyond maybe sleeping a few hours each night is just mind-boggling to me. And you're right. I think it's something that is kind of should be at the heart of the left project, is kind of shifting that conversation. But that puritanical work ethic that's kind of embedded. I feel like there's a little Puritan embedded in every American's mind that's like telling them that if they're not working, they're not valuable. And it's a really disturbing part of the American project for sure.
Yeah, it's really crazy. I mean, and that's why I really think to some degree there's no such thing as success in this form of capitalist economy. So if you're successful, you're you're Lloyd Blankfein and you're working 90 horrible hours a week. That's not success.
Right.
And by any reasonable definition of the term, you're whiling your one life away.
Yep.
And that's what you've done, Yeah,
and I've even seen it culturally, like that kind of like idea, online of like, people just saying like it's valuable to say you're busy all the time. Like, oh, I'm so busy.
Yeah.
Keeping busy, and like being busy, is a value in itself.
And and that's also something that as you know well, infects academia. I mean, how much performing of productivity have you yourself seen in your academic career?
And done.
I mean, if I were to write, if I were to write about Right. If I were to write a history of academia from the 90s till today, it would be titled Performing Productivity, because that's what people do.
Yeah.
They're always claiming to be busy, produce, and which is even kind of a bit sad, because in my opinion, the best intellectual work comes after often 4 or 5 months of just sitting and thinking.
Right. Right.
Like, you need to sit and think. Like Karl Popper didn't write his great books. I only know this because my advisor wrote a book on Karl Popper, but he wrote his best books after taking literally 5 or 6 months off just to, hang out in New Zealand and think about things.
Yeah.
So it's actually anti-intellectual to perform productivity in the academic setting, in my opinion.
Yeah, no, I love that point. And it makes me think of Walt Whitman, because one of my favorite parts about Whitman's biography, his life story, is kind of like the idea that he was always like laying around. They would always find Whitman, like whenever he had newspaper jobs, like Walt Whitman, they couldn't find him, and they'd find him under a tree somewhere, just kind of sitting there. And he thought that, and he wrote about that as, a big part of his kind of productive experience in life is laying around and being, quote unquote, what the society would call lazy. But that kind of like period of reflection is important, and we don't really. I mean, I think you can look at the kind of social and cultural and political problems that the United States are experiencing, and part of it is like that kind of like none of us have any time to sit and think. Like none of us, like the
Exactly.
whole there's really just. And especially since the internet has entered the picture and smartphones, there's really no escape from distraction, and it's just constant. That's a really hard thing to navigate, whether you're in academia or not.
Yeah, and it's incredibly difficult, especially given the vagaries of the job market, where people aren't getting interviews unless they have a book and 4 articles,
right,
et cetera, because that's what the society values. So from day one of our graduate school careers, not unwisely, and I think unfortunately correctly, given the political economic conditions on the ground, we're constantly told to publish, to produce, et cetera, and that's the only thing we can do. And there's, there really needs to be a way to step outside of the system, and hopefully people of our generation will be able to start making these enormous cultural shifts that take decades to actually implement. But I'm trying to do it one critique at a time.
Right. Yeah, I know. That's all we can do right now is throw our voices into the spiral of social media content and see if it explodes.
Yeah.
I was gonna ask you. Where did you go for undergrad? I feel like we skipped ahead from high school, but where did you go for undergrad?
For my undergrad, I went to this dual degree program at Columbia University, its School of General Studies and the Jewish Theological Seminary.
Okay, that's right. Okay.
Of America. Yeah, so I got a degree in Jewish history from Jewish Theological Seminary, otherwise known as JTS, which is the academic center of the conservative Jewish movement, which we could talk about. That conservative means something different than it does in the American political context.
Right.
And I got a degree in modern European history.
Okay.
And I did my degree in modern Europe from Columbia.
So yeah, you ended up with kind of an interesting career, because it seems like you're not really an Americanist, and you're kind of like you're like a transatlantic scholar a little bit. It seems like, because your work kind of crosses the oceans, right?
Yes, very much so. So what happened was, in my senior year of college, I interned at the Council on Foreign Relations. So as I was applying to graduate school, I did an internship there, and I remember thinking, this is after Iraq, and I'm becoming more and more left wing as time goes on, thinking about like why is everybody listening to these people at the Council on Foreign Relations? Because they were smart. I don't want to take that away from them, and I think the left does us a service when it doesn't recognize the intelligence of liberals and centrists. But I just disagreed with so many things about what they were saying about Iraq and Iran and the United States' role in the world. And I remember thinking, one, why is everyone listening to these people? And then two, why is there no heterodox perspective here? Why is everyone seem to agree on these various principles? So I had that sort of swimming around my mind as I applied to graduate school again to be a Europeanist. And I wound up going to Duke to work with this excellent scholar, I think one of the best intellectual historians today, but of course I would think that, Malachi Hakoun, who really writes about Central European Jewish intellectual history and the intellectual history of Cold War liberalism at the time, at least. And meeting him and getting progressively interested in, again, American history as I learned more about it at Duke, I wanted to blend those interests. And so I started focusing on the history of exile. Which I find the exile is a particularly fascinating creature political figure to me, because in some sense they represent the best of culture in that they're truly cosmopolitan and are embedded in two cultures, but at the same time represent or at least victims of the worst of nationalism, because they're kicked out oftentimes for their racial or political beliefs. So it's a very sort of liminal and this in my context at least, transatlantic figure that I was interested in exploring. And as always, I could bring
like there's a dash of the kind of Jewish history and history of the Holocaust and history of that particular European 20th century history. Seems like there's that in embedded in your interest too.
Yeah, absolutely. And what became interesting to me, and I think this is what helped to some degree being trained in European history, is as I read American primary documents and American history from a European lens, I think I was able to really see how one of the primary political experiences, not only for Europeans, but for Americans, was the confrontation with Nazism in the 30s. And I think that of course, historians have talked about this, but in my opinion, I think no one has made it as central to the history of American foreign policy as it really was. I think it really put the brakes on liberalism to some degree. I feel like liberalism would have gone further and further to the left were it not for Nazism. I think Nazism basically made liberals very scary of what we historians call ordinary people, and that had a really critical effect on the course of liberalism from then until today. I mean, you saw it right after the Trump election. I don't know if you remember this, but there was a cartoon in the New Yorker about some quote-unquote white working-class guy was on a plane, and he was standing up and he said, "I don't like the pilot. I should fly this plane." And, of course, like everyone who read the New Yorker thought it was absolutely hilarious and a reflection of why Trump won. But it really demonstrated to me a profound, lack of empathy for ordinary people, and really a profound lack of trust in them, which I think, was taking off in the 20s with Lippmann's critique, Walter Lippmann's critique. But really, Nazism put the nail in that coffin of really not trusting citizens who are supposed to be the center of democracy.
Right, and being wary of kind of any any rising populism as something that is to be feared. Yeah, I mean that's always been there. I mean that's been there. I mean we have a particular 20th and 21st century version of that notion, but it's certainly been. I mean that stuff is embedded in the Constitution, right? I mean the idea that the masses hold some sort of political power that has to be curtailed, that has to be contained in some way, because it's better when the elites and the ruling class have control of everything.
Yeah, I mean, and it's really embedded beyond the Constitution. It's a fundamental problem of Western thought, going back to Plato and the Philosopher King. This is really the fundamental, probably in my opinion, the capital T fundamental question of Western political philosophy. Is what do you do with the demos?
Well, yeah, and
ironically,
and liberals participate in this, as you mentioned with the New York Times, but pretty powerfully. I mean, I feel like even a year later, a year and several months later, after Trump's been elected, we're still hearing about dumb Americans who can't be trusted with the vote, basically. And there's been kind of no attempt to really, especially from the liberal establishment, to kind of take a hard look at the people who voted for Trump beyond kind of ridicule and that kind of level of just seeing them as a bunch of dumbasses that got tricked by Trump, which they may be,
even to take
but either way that kind of collective sneering at them is really not a politics.
Yeah, it's also two things. One, it's to me, it's not even a question of whether they are not, but the idea to dismiss them is anti-political.
Right.
That's just not a politics.
Right.
Or a democratic politics. So it doesn't matter what they actually are. That's a different question. But I would also say, of course, 40% of people didn't vote. So there's quite a few people who are nothing.
Yeah.
And they're up for the grab. But then even beyond the ability of not looking at these other people as on a real level, take a look at your fucking selves, man.
Right.
You think the people are stupid. Look at what the liberal establishment has done over the last, 20 years, let alone the last 70 years. There's a lot of fuck-ups. I mean, the coups in Iran and Guatemala, Vietnam, as you know better than I ever will, and various U.S. foreign policy failures over the 70s and the 80s, Iran-Contra, the Iraq War, the invasion of Afghanistan, the Libyan intervention. I mean, the elites have done terribly So take a look at yourselves if you think that, if you think like epistocracy is so great. It's crazy.
Yeah, it's a really, really frustrating time to kind of look at American politics, and hard to know what's going on. And I think that's part of, like, it's weird because we have this like kind of confusing moment, but everybody has kind of like this social media outlet to like put their take out, and so there's just this kind of like, I don't know, it's just kind of this tornado of opinion, and it's really, I think future generations will have a hard time sorting it all out. The historians of the future will be, I assume, looking through Twitter feeds and things like that as primary sources, which is a kind of weird thought.
And that's also really, really interesting because it raises the question a bit from the other side, right? Because on some level, now everyone has a voice, right? So is that sort of extreme democracy also helpful? I mean, I personally think there's a reason for expertise. Like I think the left, frankly, doesn't talk about this at all, and they really need to get their politics about this right, because you don't want a society that's completely horizontal. Maybe you do in terms of economic equality and social equality, et cetera, but in terms of actually making policy, you need experts, right? You need someone who knows an issue better than other people, right? Not every voice is equal in every single context.
I agree.
And this is something that the left hasn't talked about at all.
They're real squeamish about hierarchy and stuff like that. Yeah, I mean, I understand that, but I mean, you're right. I think you're right to bring up the New Deal as this kind of like this particular era where there were these issues were grappled with pretty profoundly, and like the idea that FDR brought in intellectuals, a team of like people that they referred to as like the brain trust to come and each are tackling different wings of the social and economic and political problems that the New Deal is kind of attempting to address. I mean, I always teach that stuff in my classes as like as a solid way to move and a solid way to make the government work. But yeah, you're right. The left is kind of squeamish about I guess subsuming the masses to experts like that. But it seems like your work has kind of been interested in intellectuals and kind of how intellectuals affect policy, right? Like that seems like that's part of what your whole thing is about, right?
Yeah, I'm basically interested in, are there institutional contexts in which it would actually be possible for people who devote themselves to a subject to make policy better and not just worse?
Right,
and I think that's a really critical question for the left to really focus on. And I think they don't, because they've never been in power, frankly, in the United States, right? If you look at left move, again, this is why it was useful to be a Europeanist. If you look at when the left governed in, the left I'm most familiar with, the SPD in 20s, Germany, they really took, seriously the question of experts and their relationship to the public, right? And I think that's a really critical question if you're actually governing. If you're actually making political decisions in a democracy where not everyone agrees with you and you don't have authoritarian power, which I am against, I think you really need to grapple with the question of expertise, publics, and democracy. And so that's what I'm really trying to do in my own work, my forthcoming book, Democracy in Exile.
Democracy in Exile, nice. And it's about a particular figure, this one.
Yeah, so this one is about, the first book's about this guy named Hans Speier, who was a left-wing social democrat in Weimar, Germany, but who is essentially moved away from Marxism in the late 20s and 30s as the result of the rise of Nazism on one hand and a violent communism to the left on another. And I really think that his experience really embodies a lot of the problems faced by left-wing intellectuals in the 20s and the 30s, and specifically people who are interested in having their work affect public policy, and eventually in the focus that I adopt, foreign policy itself.
Right. And your second, I mean, you're working on something about the Rand Corporation now. Is that right? Yeah.
So my next book, Rand didn't have archives for many years, and recently, and to their credit, I have to say, one of the presidents of Rand gave some funding to actually establishing an archive. So I've been working closely with Rand archivists to help excavate these materials, which are really, really fascinating. And I hope my next book to be a full-on history of Rand, which really will address the question of expertise and foreign policy.
It seems like it's following up with the first book. I mean, the idea. Well, first of all, like for me, like because I studied the Vietnam War, the Rand Corporation comes up quite a bit, obviously. But Americans probably, if they know anything about Rand, it might be, I don't know because I haven't seen it, but it might be featured in the new Steven Spielberg movie. Speaking of Spielberg, The Post, which is about the release of the Pentagon Papers. And I think that most Americans, if they know anything about the Rand Corporation, they know that Daniel Ellsberg, who is the person that leaked the Pentagon Papers, was employed by the Rand Corporation, was kind of a big part of the kind of I guess the practical planning of the Vietnam War, which the Rand Corporation was responsible for a lot of that. Can you talk a little bit about where does the Rand Corporation come from? Because my knowledge about it doesn't really go beyond that, and so I always thought of the Rand Corporation as kind of like this, this evil think tank that basically, was created and continues to have was created to have like a deep influence on the government, particularly foreign policy, particularly when it comes to the machine of war. But I think you probably have a more complex view of what Rand is. Where does it come from, and what is it?
I'll get to that, but I just very, very briefly, one thing interesting to note about the Rand guys who made Vietnam policy is that a lot of them fancy themselves social democrats, actually, on economic issues.
Yeah.
So just to point that out, right? They literally thought of themselves as social democrats.
Well, I mean, I don't know if you've seen. Just to follow up on that really quickly. I mean, I don't know if you've seen the film Hearts and Minds. It's a documentary about the Vietnam War, but Ellsberg makes that point. Like he explicitly he in his interview, he's like, we all consider ourselves liberals, all very much. Actually saw the Vietnam War and the Cold War itself as a liberal project. So I think it is important to point that out, that like the Rand Corporation is not like there's not I don't think of it as this kind of like hardcore like Republican or right wing place, and in fact quite the contrary, at least my impression of it.
No, that's absolutely true, and I would even say most of the older generation of Rand consider themselves to be to the left of liberalism on economic issues.
Wow.
Like well to the left of liberalism, like advocating wealth redistribution, right?
Yeah.
So this is what's also interesting is you have an incredibly left-wing social politics, domestic politics, and what we would now frame, but wasn't framed at the time, as a very right-wing or expansionist or militarist or imperial foreign policy.
Sure.
Which is it was of course not considered that way at the time, which is also something that the left again has to take seriously.
Yeah.
Right. These guys were. I mean, you literally have people who were socialist ministers in Germany working for the Rand Corporation, right? Or socialist, maybe not ministers because they were too young, but socialist officials, people who worked for the labor organization in the 20s and the 30s were now making foreign policy. And there's a very close connection between those two projects that has been included in the decades after, really particularly after Vietnam. I think that was a really critical, understandably, moment for these things. But just to get back to Rand.
Yeah.
Okay.
Go ahead.
So it's the 30s. World War II breaks out in 39. FDR, I think, is pretty much intent from early going to get involved. Starts, as you said, with the New Deal, very interested in intellectuals, et cetera, et cetera. The war breaks out. The U.S. government realizes that it really, lacks expertise on a lot of issues. There's a very small State Department, demobilization after World War I, et cetera, brings all of these intellectuals into a variety of services. Most famously, people know the Office of Strategic Services, the OSS, which was one of the precursors to the CIA. There was also the Office of War Information, which basically created propaganda, both domestically, but really the domestic propaganda shut down or hampered greatly in 43, 44, but produces propaganda sent to Germany and elsewhere. And the guy I focus on in my first book was actually a sociologist, the first student of Karl Mannheim, one of the most famous sociologists in interwar Germany.
Yep.
And he becomes actually... this might be overstating it a bit, but the Joseph Goebbels of America, in that he's personally responsible for the propaganda sent to Germany, Austria, Switzerland, and other areas of Central Europe during the war. So you have this really interesting transatlantic instance where an exile from Nazi Germany becomes head of the American propaganda effort against Germany, and is sending his own vision of what it means to be a German in the propaganda directed to Germany during World War II. Right, so that's a really interesting relationship where he's essentially in my book in the fourth chapter. I use the propaganda directives that he created. I use them as like a primary document, and he's essentially in many ways trying to pave the way for a renewed Weimar Republic in the late 40s. So he's trying to fulfill the Weimar project by using the tools of the American state.
Wow,
which is,
that's incredible.
Very interesting. Yeah,
it's just irony upon
really,
irony
cool.
there. Yeah, I love the exile angle.
Yeah.
And I mean, when people think, I feel like people talk a lot about kind of the exile of Germans into the American government in the years after World War II. And I didn't realize that this guy was doing that, was doing propaganda too. Because usually you think about that in terms of like technology. Like people like to talk about like the Nazi scientists coming over, and there's a name for that project. I'm forgetting the name of it, but there was a project for bringing Nazi scientists.
Operation Paperclip, I believe.
Yes,
Operation
that's
Paperclip.
Right. Yep.
Yes, and so that's what people think about, and the line that I have, but I don't think I've ever put it in print, so this will be the first time it's in public. But you know Dr. Strangelove, right? He's portrayed as a Nazi, as a pseudo-Nazi. If one were to find the real Dr. Strangelove, he would be in exile, he would be a Jew, and he would be a social democrat.
Wow.
Right? So that's where Cooper got it wrong.
Yeah.
Dr. Strangelove wasn't a Nazi. Dr. Strangelove was a liberal or social democratic Jewish exile.
That's really interesting because it's part. I mean, I feel like part of the weird kind of cultural associations people have with elites is that kind of feeling that they are like, they're like there's a kind of like evil, pseudo-Nazi or straight Nazi people within the government that are kind of tinkering with things, and that's a view that like a lot of Americans share about elites, and like a fear about them is that they're somehow that they're involved with they're foreign agents and they're involved with evil.
And I think a lot of that has to do with, I mean, not the way it's spoken up today, but in the certainly in the 40s and the 50s, there's a lot of anti-Semitism embedded in that.
Yeah.
Right?
Oh, totally.
Like basically Jews were able to enter the foreign policy establishment through institutions like RAND, all of the early nuclear theorists, Albert Wallstetter, Bernard Brodie, Herman Kahn, Daniel Ellsberg, Henry Kissinger. They basically made their way into the establishment mostly through think tanks like RAND, and in Kissinger's case, through the university, which were really the only American institutions to open themselves to Jews after the war, right? And it's not surprising that even today, not WASP elites, people like Condoleezza Rice, people like Paul Wolfowitz, they often didn't make their careers in the State Department, right? They made their careers again through think tanks and through universities, which were institutions open to ethnic and racial minorities, unlike any other institutions in the American state, including the military, right? So this is what's actually interesting. You have this progressive, truly progressive aspect to these institutions in the sense that they're democratizing, right? You have new constituencies making foreign policy in a way that they never were before.
Yeah, and a lot of that anti-elite, anti-academic language is rooted in anti-Semitism and is rooted in, not just anti-Semitism, but a kind of in especially the post-60s era, and kind of like recognizing that there's like all sorts of like racial associations with it too, which is that there's that academics are somehow that they're like tinkering with the society in ways that are benefiting them and no one else, and that kind of idea is really deeply ironic when you consider how like you're describing that these groups at this moment after World War II were. Academia was one of the only places where they're going to be able to have professional careers. Exactly.
And if you wanted to, let's say the way I like to think about it, let's say you're Albert Wallstetter, Bernard Brodie, or Herman Kahn, for people who don't know. These were really the most influential nuclear theorists of the United States who created the ideas that still, to some degree, inform our U.S. nuclear posture, right? So you're the son, and these are almost all men, even though I do have to say RAND, unlike the State Department, actually had quite a few women in it in the late 40s. Again, another democratizing aspect to it. But so let's say you're a Wallstetter or a Brodie or a Kahn. You're the son or grandson of Jewish refugees, often from Eastern Europe, who were victims of pogroms, when you were, 15, 16, Hitler rises to power, then all these revelations about the Holocaust after the 40s, and then nuclear war, right? So in my mind, it makes sense why all these people would dedicate themselves to trying to avoid a nuclear war, which is really what they thought they were doing, which brings us back to the irony that at least amongst the first generation of defense intellectuals, these foreign policy intellectuals of the 40s and the 50s, oftentimes they actually went into places like the Rand Corporation because thought they would actually contribute to peace.
Right.
They were worried. What they were worried about was fucking Curtis LeMay controlling the bomb without any intellectuals holding him back.
Right.
So they in these early documents, they're like, it's the moral duty of the intellectual. They actually say explicitly, listen, you can't really be a liberal or a socialist and be a foreign policy maker because the rules of foreign policy are there. It's power, it's deceit, it's all these horrible things. But those are the rule of politics. And you actually have to make the moral sacrifice as an individual to sacrifice your own, Speier's phrase, your own cherished ideals is what he called it, in order to enable people to live with them in the future, right? So there was this aspect in that they really thought that they were holding back the military from making these horrible decisions and bombing the Soviet Union in 1948 before the Soviets got the bomb. So they were actually thought that they were contributing to peace, which of course is ironic because then it leads to things like Vietnam.
Well, yeah,
right? and true horrors. Yeah.
I mean, what do you think of Ellsberg's decision to leak the Pentagon Papers? I mean, it feels like that was, in a lot of ways, he was going through a process that you're describing of kind of like grappling with kind of his own politics, but also his own like kind of morality and ethics and his kind of philosophy and that it's really, I don't know if you know the story, but like he tells he tells his turning point about like going and seeing a veteran speak and at an anti-war rally, and then like going into the bathroom and having some sort of like nervous breakdown, which was his major epiphany. And he was definitely one of those guys that you're describing, someone who really believed in the project and felt that like what he was doing was moving the world towards peace. But at the same time, he was, I guess you could call it ironic, you can call it tragic, whatever. He's like responsible for creating this machine that just rains death upon the people of Vietnam and contributes to the kind of like political crisis in the United States. So how do you grapple with all that stuff when you look at those stories?
Well, I think it's really interesting because I think it shows how easily good intentions fall into horrible effects.
Right.
And I think the problem with what these people didn't recognize is that imperialism by any name is going to be bad.
Yeah.
What they truly thought was that Europe had committed suicide in the 30s and the 40s. The United States had shown with its victory over Hitler that it was the embodiment really of Western civilization. And it was now the goal of the United States to spread Western values to the world. And what I want to highlight here is, who Walt Rostow is, of course, right?
Yes.
And you're familiar with his work on modernization theory as well, right? So for people who don't know, Walt Rostow was, again, another Jewish person of immigrants who made his way through MIT because he probably couldn't get a job in one of the more traditional institutions of American foreign policy. But what Rostow argued is that the United States should help, quote unquote, develop what was then called the Third World. And this led to a lot of horrible effects, the Strategic Hamlet program in Vietnam, and a lot of really bad development projects. But what Rostow really thought he was doing was that he was essentially repeating on an international scale what the history of the Jews in Europe and America in the 19th and 20th century, which he envisioned as a history of a transition from, the Jewish shtetl to the Berlin or New York lawyer.
Yeah,
right? So what he wanted to do is he wanted to bring the gift of cosmopolitanism and Western civilization to the rest of the world because he truly thought that that's what had, been done for the Jews, and it was fantastic, and he needed to do it again for the rest of the world. So these were people with great intentions, but what they didn't realize, and maybe no one could have realized this at the time, even though some did, like Henry Wallace, is that imperialism will always be terrible. It'll always result in death and destruction. And there's no way to be a good imperialist. Yeah, I think.
Yeah, it makes me think about the kind of we both, I think, in this conversation have had kind of I I don't know. We both seem like we're expressing positive attitudes about the role of intellectuals in public life and in the life of even creating policy. That's something that you mentioned that the left has not really embraced, and has kind of run away from, but. It seems like it's in part, and I'm thinking about like the new left that comes out of the 1960s, and there's so much to talk about with that. But it seems like that's what the new left was kind of rebelling against, and like all that like kind of hippie stuff and the counterculture was kind of saying we're throwing all that away because it's all evil, and it kind of has a the idea that like. The professor doesn't really know anything, man, and like those people are just like once they're in those elite institutions, they're completely sold out. There's no hope for them. Grow your hair long, smoke weed, and kind of stay build a commune. A lot of those impulses I feel like were in part like a rebellion against like the idea of an elite at all. And it's really super hard to figure out kind of how to reconcile all of that because it feels like. The hippies were right in one sense to like kind of see that like people like even Daniel Ellsberg, who's trying to do well, is doing terribly. And those ideas, are hard to kind of figure out. And I think it's on the one hand, I think most like kind of Marxists and left, particularly like radical leftists today, really lament the development of like identity politics and the idea of like the new left like taking things towards lifestyle and away from kind of a more practical politics. But it feels like it was almost inevitable that was going to happen as a part of the Vietnam War being that bad.
Yeah, and especially because, I mean, the new left was mostly a bourgeois phenomenon from what I understand. So It also makes sense from those people's perspectives who are relatively, safe socioeconomically. That's a relatively safe position
to take
at the time.
No,
right?
I mean,
like you
tuning in, turning on, and dropping out is like an option for a small portion of the population.
Or Harvard undergraduates, which is where Timothy Leary developed it.
Yep.
But which is actually really interesting. Like, have you read Chomsky's The Responsibility of Intellectuals recently?
Yeah, I haven't read it recently, but I read it in grad school. Yeah.
So basically, what's so interesting about that piece is that Chomsky ends with a call for third world development. Right? He critiques all of these intellectuals. He goes, Walt Rostow is a liar. Arthur Schlesinger is a liar. Two people of Jewish descent, and Chomsky himself a Jew. So this is, to some degree, an internal fight related to a lot of strands of Jewish thinking, which I'm really interested in exploring right now. But anyway, so all these things. He doesn't say don't be a policymaker per se. He says speak truth to power and tell power that they need to develop the third world.
That's
what he ends with, right?
Yeah.
You need to send money there. Now the question is, in 56, C. Wright Mills, in the Power Elite, Mills argues that you cannot be an intellectual and serve power, because what it means to be an intellectual is to speak truth, and what it means to serve power is to basically make your livelihood telling power what they want to hear. Now that's a question that I think you could take that position, that there's no way to be an intellectual and also to serve power.
Right.
But I would say that is in a democracy, in the particular democracy we have at this historical moment, maybe not in the utopia that'll come when Bernie wins or whoever wins in 2020.
When Bernie wins, it's an instant utopia. Yep.
Yeah. So when utopia comes, that'll be great. But at this historical moment, I think the left is really abrogating its responsibility by not taking this question more seriously. So let's say, for example, that there is a left-wing insurgent candidate who wins in 2020 or 2024. The machine of American empire is not going to be disabled overnight. So a responsible left wing, and I'm talking about a radical left wing. I'm not just talking about liberalism. I'm talking, from everyone from a left wing social democrat to, I guess I'm not a communist, but, people who would be considered in that camp. They need to talk seriously about what the hell they're going to do with the machinery of empire were they ever to actually get into power. Right. And this is why one of my projects, my meta intellectual projects, is to make the left aware that they need to build institutions like RAND. They need to build think tanks like all these organizations if they ever hope to actually make policy change. And just one final thing to this rant, one of the reasons that libertarianism, which in the 1950s was about as insane a movement as outside the mainstream of movement that you could have possibly been, was able to migrate to the center of American politics to some degree, is because they created these parastate institutions very early on, like the Foundation for Economic Education, the Cato Institute, et cetera, that provided an alternative policy to Washington elites. And the left has done nothing of the kind.
Yeah.
And I think that's really, really problematic.
Well, I mean, we've seen that, and this has come up on the show before. The idea of like just the last maybe 10 years of left politics. You've seen kind of there seems to be a moment. I think that a lot of people are talking about the popularity of Bernie Sanders, etc. But even before that, you had the Occupy movement, which happened at the same time as the Tea Party movement, that were both rising, as I think in both their own ways as a reaction to the Obama administration. But in either case, the Tea Party set up institutions and got people into Congress, and Occupy didn't get anybody into Congress and didn't set up any lasting institutions. And if there's one thing that I hear from the baby boomers that I've talked to on this show, and the baby boomer generation of leftists that were around in the 1960s, that's one thing that they lament a lot, is that the lack of lasting institutions that were built that could have kind of produced some sort of political, social, cultural, and intellectual continuity for the project that the left was about. We have it feels like when we think about the 1960s, people think about the Beatles and the Rolling Stones and stuff like that more than they think about kind of the extraordinary burst of political activity that really began to transform this country in very, very positive ways and negative ways, but in either case began to really grapple with some of these big ideas, and there's nothing left of it. I mean, I think that I wrote a book on GI coffee houses that's about,
of course, yeah.
The idea that
I have it.
Yeah, okay, awesome. So the idea that
we sold 2 copies.
That's so cool. I'm very, very, very happy about that. I think that puts me on the bestseller list, I think. But the idea that I just had a dude write to me because I had this op-ed in the New York Times recently about the coffee houses, and all these new left and kind of activist guys and veterans, writing me and telling me their experiences. And the one of the people that wrote me today was a person who he opened or helped open a bookstore in Cambridge near Harvard. Called Common Sense, a Common Sense bookstore. That was, kind of this place where, radicals met and not only picked up copies of, Mao's Little Red Book and the Communist Manifesto and things like that, but they also, produced underground newspapers. They planned activities and demonstrations and things like that. And there were in other words, there were physical spaces. And I think that it's a small phenomenon, but in either case, I think that, your point is a good one. The idea that where are the institutions of the left? One of the best books I read that really got me thinking about all these issues when I was in graduate school is this book by Anne Enke. Her last name is Enke, and it's called Finding the Movement. And it's really about feminist institutions of the 1960s and 70s, including bookstores and coffee houses and even softball leagues and all sorts of stuff. And she really brought this idea out for me. She's a sociologist, not a historian, but really brought this idea out to me that that where do people go when they're looking for the left in our time, right now, 2017? Where do you find the left? You find it on a hashtag. That doesn't seem It doesn't seem like that's a place where we can really build something powerful. Maybe it is. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, I would say in the peculiar historical conditions of modern America, from my understanding of historically the American state, is that institutions are critical. I'm not saying from a philosophical perspective, we could leave that out, but as historically existing, the United States for political change often relies on institutions. And I'm all in favor of organizing, et cetera, but it seems to me, especially in the last, 6-7 years since Occupy, that organizing has become sort of this panacea for everything the left must do. It almost means nothing at this point. We have a problem, let's organize.
Yeah. Right.
We have this issue, let's organize. And it never happens. Because frankly, there's very few workspaces left, and people still use an industrial model where most the United States never had strong white-collar unions for a variety of peculiar historical conditions, and that's where most work takes place these days. in the service industry, et cetera. So there's that problem. And I think, as you said, it's really to the benefit. Now, I don't want to say that like it's all the left's fault. I mean, there are particular structural conditions. For example, the left doesn't have as many billionaires who are willing to give all this funding. And
we've got George Soros, and that's it. I get a check every week from George Soros, who tells me what to post on Facebook and Twitter.
Right, exactly. And so I'm waiting. I've got an article at a magazine. I read everything Soros has written, and what's interesting to me is that Soros has no vision of democratic political change.
Right.
All of his political change is talking about the elite. So Soros, like every liberal, leaves out the public because he doesn't trust the public. Makes sense. He, had to hide in Hungary during the Holocaust. I understand why he doesn't trust quote unquote ordinary people, but he really has no vision of democratic political change, which is really problematic. So it's not all the left.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. It's not just the left's failure. Yeah. I mean, and it's almost like I feel like it's a contradiction at the heart of the left too, because it feels like like we've talked about in this whole conversation, the left has this kind of skepticism about kind of like creating a business or creating an institution like that, or creating any sort of hierarchical institution that mirrors all the same models of like patriarchy and everything else. So like, all those kinds of like critiques that are there have ironically maybe that's the right word, I'm not sure, but they've kind of like I don't know. It's blocked the it blocks the left from really developing the kind of institutions you're talking about, because it just doesn't seem like it's part of what the left's project is all about at all.
Yeah, and those are real critiques, right? I think both you and I would recognize those are real.
Yeah, no, I bring them up because I feel them myself. I'm like, I don't want to start a fucking think tank, dude. That's it. Like, that's not what we need right now.
It's horrible.
Yeah,
exactly. But I mean, this is why I think you need to have different areas of the movement do different things. So let me put this as maybe as harshly or in as starkest terms as I could think about. From what I can tell from the left on Twitter is everyone fancies themselves a working class hero.
Right.
Which is great. Working class heroes are great, right? But if you look at what actually existing lefts who held power thought about, they recognize that different people in the movement have different capabilities and different things to do, right? So intellectuals are useful for a very particular purpose. They have the time and the freedom to really think about ideas, right? And so that's what intellectuals should do. They shouldn't, I mean, intellectuals could be activists. I'm not prescriptive, et cetera, but in my mind, the best thing an intellectual does is be an intellectual, not necessarily be an activist, right? Activists should be activists. Organizers should be organizers. Intellectuals should be intellectuals, and they should all be part of a coherent socialist movement, right? And I think we need to really think more, again, like no one likes a division of labor. We all know Marx's critique, but again, in this particular historical moment in the democratic capitalist Western United States, there are particular things that work and there are particular things that don't. And oftentimes I think the division of labor would be useful for thinking about how the left could actually go about bringing power. And again, experts are critical to that, and foreign policy experts are really critical to that, because America is an empire. It controls the world. And even if the left were to win in 2020, we'll still have hundreds of bases. We'll still have X amount of aircraft carriers, whatever it is now, 11, 12, or 13. And those are still going to be patrolling the waters of the world, whether or not Bernie Sanders or let's say even Jill Stein is in power.
Right.
And so we need to take these questions very seriously, and it seems that it is not where the general thrust of things are going, which is ironic because so many leftists are intellectuals.
Yeah, that is. And to me, like, if you would have told me, I mean, I never would have expected that you telling me about the Rand Corporation would give me an entryway to think about kind of the value of intellectuals in public discourse and in policy, but it makes sense, and it's now I understand. Like, when I first started looking at your work, I wasn't sure what your angle on it was, but it feels like you've explained it really clearly to me. That kind of idea that I like your idea of like the particular historical context we're in, because the left is in a lot of ways it feels like the left is like a utopic project. And I think that's probably part of what we're talking about, of how the left kind of shoots itself in the foot by kind of not seeing the maybe clearly what the steps might be towards that utopia, thinking that it kind of is instantly manifests once the revolution is in the streets. But it seems like once the revolution is in the streets, I mean, you saw this in during the French Revolution. At some point, someone's going to take it over and move it and start doing things with it.
Of course.
So having a stable of left intellectuals, not only intellectuals, but a stable of you're talking about a division of labor in which everyone has a role to play, would be that would probably be a positive development for the possibilities of actually getting to that utopia.
And this is day one Marxism, right? Marxism. What matters to Marx? History.
Right.
The peculiar materialist historical conditions you actually live in.
Yep.
And if Marx was writing in 2017, he wouldn't be right. He's not the Marx of capital.
Right.
Things have happened since then. We saw what happened. Not only, the Soviet Revolution is, I think, really relevant, right? What happens with revolution? How quickly did it? It took 4 or 5 years to descend into Stalinism.
Yep.
That
window is critical, and it feels like we might have that window. It feels like we might have that window in our lifetime. But right now, if we had that window, I think the left, as we see it right now, would totally squander it. And I don't like saying that, but it feels like we're not set up. We're not set up to take power. And in part, maybe that's because we've never had power, like you've pointed out.
I think it's because we've. I don't, this isn't quite the right term, but there's something decadent about the American left.
Yes.
And that decadence emerges from the fact that it never held power.
Yeah.
And it didn't hold power, not just because of the left. It was systematically oppressed by the state, a lot of reasons. It's not
the left's fault. It is, and I think it's worth, the left can take some criticism, and fighting amongst the left is kind of a hallmark of the left too. But I love that. I love that point of the decadence. It's we didn't get socialism, but we got Whole Foods, right? And that kind of idea seems like it's totally unsustainable.
Yeah, or beyond. I would say for really our generations of leftists, it's more like, man, I've never actually done anything on the ground or taken this question seriously, but I have 50,000 Twitter followers.
Yeah.
Right? The sort of micro celebrity that Yasmin Nair talks about. She's 100% right on this, I think.
Yes.
It's a popularity contest, and that's what I mean by decadence.
Yeah.
Right? And it's not decadence, even though it might destroy you morally and personally and according to your soul. It's to work for fucking Rand in 1948.
Yeah.
Right?
Exactly.
Now they were wrong. There are a lot of, but I really don't want to make it seem like I am extremely critical of these guys for a lot of very, very serious reasons. But why I find this whole subject interesting is I wonder if it is possible to create institutions that don't do horrible things like the think tanks of the 40s and the 50s and the 60s and later on did. And then we could get in, if you want, into what exactly I think went wrong there. And it actually has to do with historical analogies, which are critical to this very moment that we're living through right now. So I could go to that for a second if you'd like.
Sure. Yeah, sure. Go ahead. What happened?
So basically, what I think really happened, and this is why I think the most important period in American foreign policy history, and perhaps even world history, is the period between 1945 and 1949. Because unlike most historians, I don't think the Cold War was overdetermined by 46 or 47.
Mm-hmm.
I think the crucial thing that we could really see from today in light of the militaristic politics since the end of the Cold War is that the fundamental framework of American foreign policy that grew up in tandem with the rise of the American empire was the notion that the United States is constantly on the verge of facing an existential threat.
Yes.
Right? You saw that rhetoric after 9/11 with the axis of evil.
Yep.
You saw it with Iran, North Korea, Iraq. You saw it more recently with ISIS, which is fucking insane. ISIS was absolutely 0% threat to the United States.
Yep.
Et cetera, et cetera. But I think that rhetoric of existential war was really solidified between 45 and 49, where a generation of people scarred by the rise of Nazism and the Holocaust and World War II basically transferred their anxieties about Nazism as an existential threat, which I think it truly was.
Yep.
to the Soviet Union,
right,
which I don't think, in retrospect, we're learning it never actually was.
Yeah.
So that metaphor has distorted American foreign policy and, I believe, undergirded American imperialism since, let's say, 1945, 46, 47, 48, 49. And I really think that that was why so many of the horrible things that these very smart people did was linked to the fact that they constantly viewed themselves as literally fighting an existential war because they were traumatized by the interwar experience and you got
the Cold War and the terms of the Cold War are a big part of explaining why the Vietnam War happened. Every single story of the Vietnam War begins with the Cold War and kind of like, well, you have, and there's various levels of people making excuses for it, but like you have to understand the context of the Cold War and kind of how Americans, particularly American policymakers, were viewing the world at this moment. There are reasons why they developed that worldview. A lot of different reasons why, and in part, it's Nazism is one part, but the other is just like seeing an opportunity for imperial control in the years after World War II. But in either case, I think you're right. It feels like that Cold War template of seeing, an existential threat to the United States everywhere, it never went away. It's still driving our politics.
And it's direct. I mean, it's not even like it's not even like correlation. Paul Wolfowitz's advisor was Albert Wallstetter. These are very direct connections. Doug Feith, Zalmay Khalilzad, all of these people, Richard Pearl, were trained by Wallstetter.
Right.
Wallstetter, growing up in the 30s and the 40s, had a reason to think that he was constantly, like, existential threat was a real problem for the United States, right? But then there's this sort of intellectual inertia, which is, I think, what's really problematic about the institutions that we have today. Like, there's no elite accountability.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So it's horrible. So you have all these elites making shitty policies over and over and over again before going to the Heritage Foundation. Before then being rehired by Donald Trump, et cetera, et cetera. And probably the most interesting thing about Trump's first year in terms of foreign policy was that he initially tried to rely on alternative elite networks, right? Steve Bannon, Sebastian Gorka, people who would have been laughed out of anything earlier as a joke. He tried to rely on them, but ultimately he's just come down with the military effectively, right?
Right.
So he just relied on what all these defense intellectuals were worried about. He's given the keys of the kingdom to H.R. McMaster, Kelly, and Mattis.
Yeah, I think that the history that you're involved in is such a critical one, and I hope that people are reading it. I hope that people find your work, and I'm sure you're teaching it in your classes too, right? Yeah,
of course. Well, it's kind of funny now. All my students think it was all linked to Nazism, so maybe I need to. I'm overcorrecting in sort of the wrong.
Well, it's a weird. I mean, it must be weird for you because the discourse these days is a lot about Russia, a lot about Nazis. Rising Nazism.
Yeah.
So it must be a strange time to be alive for you.
Yeah, it's actually really interesting. I don't know. I wrote a piece for Jacobin in December 2016, basically criticizing everyone for using what myself and my co-author, Udi Greenberg, a professor at Dartmouth, called the Weimar analogy.
Right.
And I've got a piece coming out about how the Weimar analogy has been used by intellectuals since the 30s to basically justify, American imperialism repeatedly over and over and over again. I mean, and it's still people are making the analogy today, and I think it's a significant problem because I think it deracinates the term. So let's say there was actually a Nazi threat as there was in like Charlottesville. It makes everything equal, by calling everything Nazism, nothing's Nazism. And so the term loses its power. And two, it's just not an accurate reflection of the world. The United States is overwhelmingly powerful. Nazism was actually, to some degree, an existential threat to Western democracy in a way that nothing that has happened since 1945 has been.
Right.
And it's really, really problematic. It's one of the foundational analogies of modern American political history.
Of course.
And so I think by historicizing it, you could actually hopefully make it lose its power because it's just not relevant, in my opinion, and it really distorts politics.
Totally.
Especially left-wing and liberal politics.
100%. I mean, there's that like Godwin's Law thing, right? Or it's like the idea that someone brings up Nazis eventually, but it's such a powerful analogy in American discourse, and yet yet it doesn't really serve a good political purpose. And you're right. I think it doesn't really. I think it drives especially historians crazy because they're like, it's the same thing with the Civil War coming up again and again, where you're kind of like. I wish that people grappled with these ideas in a more complicated way than this kind of, because at this point it seems like not the Civil War and ideas of Nazism and Hitler have gone through this like kind of multi-decade process of like pop culture that have like kind of created these words that are really kind of divorced from the historical reality they were supposed to represent. That's a really tough thing to get over. I think we'll be talking about Nazis for a while still.
Oh my God! Unfortunately, I guess. Well, it's kind of funny. Just all these like the recent Trump thing. People have actually been interested in my work, so it's terrible for the world, but I guess good for me professionally. If that's not capitalism, I don't know what is. But another thing that I want to emphasize is that why it's also critical to understand the existential element is that this was the ideology that was institutionalized in what we call the national security state. The national security state, let's say the National Security Council, the CIA, the Department of Defense, and I would add to it think tanks like RAND, academic centers like MIT Center for International Studies. They're all part of this state and parastate structure. They were actually created to institutionalize a fight against existential politics, right? Mm-hmm. They're constantly ready to tomorrow to launch a war, because the United States was worried that a third world war, they wouldn't have the time to mobilize like they did between 39 and 41, right? Or even a little bit earlier.
Yeah.
So I think like what people don't understand is that the national security state is actually the institutional instantiation of the crisis politics, which is why I think partially, at least, the reason that the United States constantly thinks itself in terms of foreign policy to be on the verge or on the brink of a crisis.
Wow.
Because its institutions are literally organized for a crisis moment, but the crisis moment has become everything. And I think this is really critical. And this is, I think, one of the major takeaways of my first book, which everyone should, of course, buy. It's important to support academic books. Democracy in Exile, Hans Speier and the Rise of the Defense Intellectual. But really what's critical about this first book is that it was the peculiar historical conditions of the Cold War which made the crisis of American foreign policy permanent. So if you see people writing in the 30s, people like Hans Speier, he's like, listen, we have to adopt totalitarian methods. We have to use propaganda. We have to use mass mobilization. Listen, I know we're all liberals, we're all socialists, we hate this, but the only way we're going to defeat the Nazis if we adopt what he termed totalitarian methods or totalitarian means of social control. But what's really critical, I think, is that in the 30s, Speier and people like him, they argued that when you defeated the Nazis, life would return to normal.
Right.
But
it's not a permanent crisis.
Soviets,
yeah.
It's not a permanent crisis.
Right.
But with the Soviets, especially once the Soviets get the bomb, so what I've been actually arguing in my scholarly work is that the Cold War doesn't really begin until 49, because it's when the Soviets get the bomb, is that when everyone accepts, even people who were skeptical of this between 45 and 49, when the Soviets get the bomb in August 49, Americans learn about it in September, but when they get the bomb, it convinces people that, holy shit, they're actually truly an existential threat. But the qualitative difference between nuclear weapons and what weapons they were used to that were being used to fight the Nazis is that you couldn't actually really engage in nuclear war, right? There's some discussions about tactical nuclear weapons, and I do believe the United States was ready to fight a nuclear war. Should Soviet troops cross into West Germany, I think they would have fought a nuclear war. But in retrospect, we could see is that both sides weren't exactly excited to fight a nuclear war. So instead, the crisis becomes permanent because it can't ever end.
Endless permutations of mutually assured destruction for
exactly.
Basically. I mean, I feel like our lives. This is why I use the atomic bomb and the mushroom cloud in so much of the kind of visual material for this podcast is in part because we're living in that moment where it's kind of like feels like, well, we're in this crisis because of the existence of the nuclear bomb. We're in this until the end of history. And that's a really, really
exactly
terrifying place to be in. And I think, you're right in terms of the angle that you're talking about on it, like the idea that since our institutions are kind of created within that context, that there's really no other context that they can behave. And so we have to kind of look to those institutions, change them, eliminate them, create new ones if we want to get out of that.
Exactly. I think it's ultimately an institutional problem. Exactly. And you really saw this with the end of the Cold War. I mean, rationality is itself a historically contingent term. It's meant different things over different times, but in common usage, I will say you cannot rationally think that ISIS is a threat to the United States. But this is what literally almost everyone in the mainstream American foreign policy establishment, what Obama called the blob, even though I guess he was taken over by the blob, but what Obama called the blob, argued for years and years that ISIS was an existential threat to the United States. It's fucking insane.
Yeah.
And so I think all of these things. Sorry, yes.
Yeah, no, I didn't mean to interrupt you. I was just agreeing that it's insane, no. And it makes me think of like I don't know, all the way down to like Fox News talking about the war on Christmas. You know, they kind of like depict this idea that Muslim law is kind of has taken over every town in America, and we all have to practice Islam now instead of Christianity, and like that. It seems like that those kinds of like dumb shit that you see that actually has currency in our culture, is part of that. Is part of that kind of that context that's in the foreign policy institutions that are casting ISIS as this like ridiculous threat.
Right, and I think that and this is why I think the guys who I focus on ultimately went really wrong, is that they really didn't focus on intellectual accountability. Right, because they were so traumatized by World War II, so traumatized by the Nazis, so traumatized by the nuclear weapons, that they were just constantly fighting a war, even when there were no reasons to really fight a war. We can see from today. So again, I'm not praising the defense intellectuals. They went really wrong and had a lot of problems. But I think we as a left need to develop these alternatives. Yeah, no, because if we don't, sure as shit, no one else will.
Right. No, I agreed. Daniel Bessner, that's a really, really compelling set of points you made. And I encourage everyone to check out your book on Amazon, Democracy in Exile, been mentioned a few times. But check that out because I think we got to get the plugs in, man. But the idea that the ideas that you're writing about and using history, I think are really, really great examples of how to use history to kind of like reflect on the big questions we're still grappling with. So thank you so much for joining me and talking with me.
Thanks a lot, David. I really had a good time.
Okay, I want to thank my guest, Daniel Bessner. I had a really great time talking to him about all that stuff. Really, really a lot to chew on with that episode. And I'd appreciate anyone who has comments or ideas. Find me on Twitter at David L. Parsons. You can follow the show on Facebook, Instagram. Nostalgia Trap is all over the place. Look for it online. You can find all this stuff. But I especially would appreciate if you give a little money to the show. If that's something that you can do, patreon.com/nostalgiatrap. Thanks so much for all supporting the show and all the listeners. I really appreciate your attention to these very, very important issues. Thanks again. We'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.